Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm Managing Director in the Cybersecurity Practice at Venable, a law firm in DC. I also work as an advisor to FIDO Alliance, helping them navigate some of the issues around the intersection of authentication technology and standards with all the places that policy and regulation play a role in authentication, including in the financial services and fintech world. To that end, I'm thrilled that we get to have some time in today's event to focus in on what is, in my view, the single most important standards effort in fintech, the work of the Financial Data Exchange, or FDX as it's more commonly known. At a time when fintech is driving a wave of innovation in financial services, creating new ways to bank, to invest, to pay, to make more informed financial decisions, so much of what we're trying to accomplish depends on enabling consumers to have an easy, secure way to authorize different parties to access different elements of the financial data. And as you'll hear today from Don Cardinal, who's FDX's executive director, that's really where the Financial Data Exchange comes in. It's the one group that's here in the US that has brought banks, fintech firms to work together to create an API that can allow the exchange of data easily and securely. So easy and secure, this also is where FIDO comes in. And as Don's going to explain today, FIDO authentication plays a core role in the architecture used to secure data exchange through the FDX API. So Don, let me hand things over to you for an intro to FDX, and then you and I will take a little bit of time to chat.
Well, thanks for having me this afternoon, Jeremy. My name is Don Cardinal. I'm the Managing Director of Financial Data Exchange. So let me tell you a little bit about what FDX is. It is an international, not-for-profit technical standards body. Now, we're dedicated to unifying the financial service industry around an interoperable, royalty-free standard for secure permission and access to data. We are not a lobbying group, and we don't comment on policy. That's actually a good thing. We have over 175 member organizations all around the world on 4 continents. We have about 12 million users using the spec today. Unfortunately, we still have another 80 or so million credentials to get out of the ecosystem, but with Jeremy's help and with FIDO's help, we'll get there. So let me tell you a little bit about how FDX came together. We are a technical standards body, but we didn't just think it up in a small room. We actually shopped the planet for best ideas. We looked at the granddaddy of all of these standards, Open Financial Exchange, OFX. We looked at what was going on around the world in the UK. We looked at the tokenized access through OpenID Connect, through OpenID Foundation, as well as IETF standards for how best to promote and preserve a standard. NIST for security protocols. Of course, we're a subsidiary of the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center. That's a mouthful rather. We call them FSISAC for short. And of course, we do look at what our friends in Australia and the UK are doing as well. And we couldn't do it without FIDO. That's all well and good, Don. What does that mean? Well, it means we've basically taken the best of everything and stitched together what we feel is the best. So what does that mean to the consumer? Well, let's look at this flow that I'm showing right now. You get your FinTech app on your phone. It says, hey, great, welcome. We're going to help you do your taxes or invest or budget. It says, I'm going to need the following accounts. Are you cool with that? Yes, I will. Okay, where do you bank or invest? In this case, we're going to choose the red brand, whichever one they want that to be. The session's then handed over to the data provider. Now, it could be, in this case, a bank or brokerage, doesn't really matter. All the authentication is done there on that real estate. It's done nowhere else. No one else is part of the authentication step. Of course, we really recommend U2F through FIDO. Why? It's the best experience for the consumer. After that, you consent. Yep, I absolutely do want to do this. Here are the accounts I want to do. No, don't bring over my kid's account. And boom, we hand you back to the app. From there on out, all access is tokenized. It's really that simple. The customer needs to do nothing different. But why is it so powerful? We were very careful in designing these user journeys. We focus group tested them with a variety of skill levels, from folks who are non-techie through the very technical savvy people. And it turns out really biometrics were part of the key to making this palatable for everyone. In this case, we show face, but of course, fingerprint and other biometric modalities are certainly available. But we found that it was the best use of positive and negative friction and tested the best amongst all the things we looked at. So that's why we're so excited to include FIDO in our key security documents, as well as our user experience journeys. So with that, it still puts the consumer in the middle. You see in our example here, the consumer starts the process, provides the authentication, holds their biometric. It's a key tenet, as of course with FIDO, that the customer never releases the actual biometric. I think it's a very important reminder that we follow that as well. And the customer's always front and center in transparency, deciding who to share, what to share, for how long. So it's why FIDO is a very natural fit into our stack, why we included it in our architecture, and it's really why we're here. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate the introduction. So I wanted to just, talk through a little bit of what you presented and dive a little bit deeper. The default, I think, that most consumers are used to or have been for most apps, if they've been, doing business with a fintech, has been password-based screen scraping, where you're just told, hand your password over to a third-party app, and then they're able to log in more or less as you to your bank to get information. What are some of the issues that you've run into there on a security and a usability perspective?
Well, whenever you share a secret, you always increase your risk surface. There's always the risk that something will happen to it. So the whole idea is if you can get IDs and passwords out of the ecosystem, you have reduced your risk surface. By doing it very carefully, though, you've not impacted the customer experience. In addition, when you're a consumer, if you've got to keep track of all these IDs and passwords and where you have them. So by having them in fewer places, you actually are making it a little bit easier on your mind share. I'm getting a little older there. So it's really useful as far as that. We're seeing more and more IDs and passwords showing up in Pastebin on dark websites. And so the fewer places they exist, the better you are in your risk profile.
Thanks. And I know on the security side, FinCEN, who's the Treasury Department's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, has been outspoken in a couple instances on some of the risks that they've seen with some of these password-based sharing apps. I think it was in just last fall, they shared they're seeing more than $1 billion a month in identity-related cybercrime in the financial services industry. By the way, that's not just with fintech. I think that's across the board. But all of this, more than $1 billion just by exploiting weak identity or authentication controls. And in 2019, their director, Ken Blanco, said at a speech, I read here, in some cases, cyber criminals appear to be using fintech aggregators and integrators to facilitate account takeovers on fraudulent wires. And by using stolen data to then create fraudulent accounts on these platforms, criminals can exploit the platform's integration with other legacy financial services firms. How does the API help address these issues and provide a more secure foundation for these types of bank-to-bank or bank-to-fintech interactions?
Sure. First of all, the connections between a fintech, a data intermediary like an aggregator, and the actual data source, would be a bank, brokerage, or insurance company, is done with B2B level or business to business enterprise grade security, right? So it's not just logging in and pretending to be the consumer anymore. You actually have things like access control lists, negotiated white lists. You also have mutual TLS. You have, of course, TLS with 1.2 and higher in your HTTPS session. So there's a variety of defenses in depth that make it a much more robust, much more modern interaction between all the parties in the chain that just quite innocently isn't there with screen scraping. But remember, screen scraping has been around for 25 years. We like to joke it's old enough to buy alcohol. It's been in use for so long. But the security concerns you bring up are kind of why we consume said alcohol.
Excellent. And when it comes to MFA, there's a lot of ways you can do MFA. You can use one-time passwords or an SMS code. You can use push notifications, standalone dongles. Why was FIDO chosen as sort of the preferred MFA modality within FDX?
Sure, it all comes down to the end user, the consumer. When we did our focus group testing on the different user journeys to grant consent, to provision the consent, to authenticate, the one thing that worked out really well was that ease of use. It's something you're very comfortable with. Humans are very tactile creatures, very emotive, very visual creatures. So irrespective of how it worked, it really worked out better. And of course, with dongles, there's the expense, there's the issue of losing them. With push messages, you have to have an app already enrolled and comfortable there. With SMS, we saw NIST has already deprecated that. You see SIM swapping and other issues with telephone devices. So FIDO was kind of the best in breed for that for U2F for a variety of reasons, mostly around customer experience, but also for a better scalable way of getting to U2F and strong customer auth. We built the spec to be usable anywhere on the planet, and SCA or multi-factor auth was mandated in every jurisdiction, and this was one very good way of getting there.
Thanks. Well, I know, mentioning SCA, which, was the strong customer authentication standards that were mandated in Europe, the U.S. has been really different. We haven't had any regulations here to date. For the most part, it seems like the regulators and Treasury and the Hill have all sort of waved their hands at, what I would say innovation in the financial services space and said, we hope we can make great things happen. But I know that changed late last year when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that they're finally looking at potentially putting regulations out, probably not quite the same as we saw in Europe with Payment Services Directive 2, but they're looking at regulating nonetheless. And they, specifically flagged, I think in the preamble, consumers have an interest in being able to secure data access effectively and in a manner that enables ongoing and efficient consumer-friendly market innovation. So I think we've talked about why passwords fall short there. I mean, they're not particularly secure and they're not particularly consumer-friendly. But with regard to where the CFPB is looking, they also talked a lot in their advance notice around industry-led solutions. And while I know you guys don't weigh in, explicitly on the policy side, is there an industry-led approach that they can point to? And, do you have any thoughts in terms of where we might end up here in the U.S. as we look to do more in this space on the regulatory space?
Sure. As a technical standards body, the whole idea is you want a standard that has basically been vetted by the market. Just as steel sharpens steel, one person sharpens another, to quote from the Bible. The idea of open standards available with a lot of players, a big tent, makes for a better standard simply because there's more eyes on it, trying to hone it and improve it. And that's why we were very diligent to get consumer groups, academics, large FIs, small FIs, trade associations, and not just in the US, but in other jurisdictions as well, to bring disparate viewpoints, to bring really new eyes to it, to make sure that this was fit for purpose and would work scalably in different jurisdictions. And I think we've done a better job, I'm going out on a limb here, than other jurisdictions have, in making sure that the small fintechs, for example, have a seat at the table and a voice. Over time, I think that's going to make this more durable. I think we're going to see more adoption because more of the people who are actually going to use it, who are dependent on the customer and their security for their life's blood rather, and their company's success, are there in driving this.
Thanks. It's good to hear. And when you start talking about at a practical level, let's say I'm looking to implement the FDX API and all the control considerations. What does that actually mean? Let me talk specifically about FIDO. Is FIDO something for the banks to implement in terms of how they authenticate their users, or is it something that the aggregators and the fintechs also have to be using on their side?
Good question. Remember how in the diagram we talked about you hand the session over to the data source. The data source could be a utility, could be an insurance company, it could be a bank. You're re-leveraging the existing authentication stack they already have. So if they already have a FIDO server set up for their online and mobile banking, if they already have that service set up for one of their other channels, they're simply re-leveraging their existing auth stack. That's one of the things we tried very hard to do, is to make the implementation of FDX is least burdensome as possible.
Thanks. And I'm imagining, since there's going to be more pressure on banks to be leveraging the FDX API, the fact that you're recommending FIDO, look, I think we've heard in this broader session, this Authenticate conference today, about how financial services firms are already leveraging FIDO, but I'm assuming this will be one more reason that they should start to move away from legacy authentication into something like FIDO.
Absolutely. It's one more use case to help drive the business demand for, yes, we really need to get on board with this. Yes, we need to accept, maybe one or more modalities. Yes, it's another way we're going to improve the user experience. If you think about it, APIs are a net new channel. Just like online was a new channel for banks, then mobile was a new channel. APIs are the next new channel for banks as they look at both revenue and expense plays in this space, and certainly authentication needs to go with them.
And I want to point out FDX, when I look at the control considerations, it's not just FIDO. That's not the only security standard that's called out. You also talk a lot about leveraging OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect to deliver a sort of holistic approach to security to facilitate data exchange. How does FIDO work with those other two standards, OAuth and OIDC, to deliver a solution?
Sure. So remember, when you hand the session over, you already have basically your network. If you do it with the OSI model, right, and you're several layers up in that, so the session's already protected and encrypted. You already know where it's coming from, so you have typically a whitelist for access control. Your WAF, your web access firewalls, already vetted in that, but you still have to authenticate the consumer. So if you look at the OpenID Connect extension onto OAuth 2, it looks also for authentication. Now, it will support credential-based as well, but they have a strong preference as well for why go to all the trouble of tokenizing ID and password and then still rely on it for authentication? It seems a little and antithetical, which is why they're a big proponent as well of that. But the whole idea is to stop sharing IDs and passwords, stop using them in the entire session. Ideally, if you have OIDC and FIDO through an FDX, you can enroll, use, provision, and consume this whole setup and never use a credential, which I think are really powerful in today's day and age.
That's a good point. I wanted to get your take. Europe's been interesting to contrast to the U.S. They obviously regulated, much earlier than the U.S. did, and the regulations came out, and then it seemed like people had to try to figure out, well, what is the technology we're going to use? What are the APIs and the security protocols to actually enable it? The U.S. has been opposite. Industry has been leading here with, banks and fintechs and aggregators and other companies in the ecosystem all working together before regulation. How quickly do you see things moving here in the U.S., given that approach?
Well, given that we were at 12 million users over Christmas time and with no mandate, you look at the UK now, it's a smaller market given and due, but they had a government mandate and they just now crossed 3 million users. That's the strength of the demand in North America. We estimate that in total, there were around 110 million credential pairs floating around outside of FIs being shared for a variety of reasons. And like I said, we've fixed 12 million of it. There's another 80 or so million left to go. Little job security, but if you look at the adoption curve, the path, it's way faster than online banking, way faster than mobile banking, even EMV card. Even when everyone agreed those were wonderful things and must-haves. So I think we're gaining on the adoption.
And I wanted to ask as well, with that, FDX is largely focused in the U.S., but are you starting to play in countries outside the U.S.? Are there other countries that are also looking to leverage the work that you've done here?
Well, sure. A quarter of our members are Canadian. So yes, our neighbors to the north, certainly. We have a Canadian working group that's actively making sure that the spec is fit for purpose for them. But we have members on 4 continents. I just had a call this morning with a members firm in Israel. I've talked to our friends in Dubai. We even have one in sub-Saharan Africa and a few in APAC. There's a huge demand for this, but the idea of having each market weigh in and have the ability to influence the spec to make sure it's fit for purpose for them, instead of ceding that control to some other jurisdiction and hoping they get it right and think about your particular needs. It's not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy, especially when it comes to tech. We very much have to have certainty. In a digital world, we code to 1 or 0. And so being able to be at the table and influence the spec and make sure your market's uniqueness is reflected, I think is a real demand driver.
Excellent, thanks. Well, that's the questions I had today. I think we're now at that portion where we're going to magically change into new shirts and pop up live to answer a few new questions, or maybe we'll have coordinated. We'll find out in a moment. But thanks, everybody. Thanks, Don.
Thank you.